So there we go. We started recording. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the UU Virtual Roundtable. My name is Sarah Reyes, and I'll be today's moderator. Before we start, just a couple of quick things. So number one, we will be recording this session and uploading it to our YouTube page, the UUCLC YouTube page. You can find these on the website, I believe. And pretty easy to access. If not, they'll also be on the Facebook page as well, if that's a lot easier. Second thing, I'm not too sure how this one will be run, but for the most part, if our speaker is kind of in the middle of, I guess, a little segment of discussion, let's hold off on interrupting and anything such as that, just to keep the flow of everything going. If he's open to having questions asked, feel free to. Those are the only things I would necessarily state for now. But that's about it. So feel free to take over, Jerry.
Okay, Jerry, yeah, you can provide comments and then ask questions anywhere you want.
Okay, well, what I did prepare is as instructed by Paul, and he takes our money every week in the golf course.
Oh, I wish.
So this is a debt. I'm paying a debt off to him. Anyway, he asked me to present for about 30 minutes around there, and then give you an opportunity to ask questions on any of the information I'm provided. And the topic basically he asked me to speak to was, introducing you to the tribal groups in New Mexico. So I'm going to kind of focus on New Mexico. There are close to 570 federally recognized tribes in the United States. And there are also state recognized tribes, for example, in Louisiana and Texas, where they don't, especially Texas, where they don't allow federally recognized tribes, but there's a few state recognized tribes. But anyway, I'm going to start you off with a little story, because almost my whole life I've always had to answer to the question as it relates to my name, Smith, and where I got that. Especially when I went to school, when I came down to Las Cruces and attended New Mexico State, they would call my name out, and everybody expect a Anglo person to stand up or raise his hand, and I would raise my hand, and they look at me kind of cross-eyed. So really, it's a short story. My great-grandfather, as a young boy growing up in Laguna, New Mexico, and that's about 40 miles west of Albuquerque on I-40. He was out tending livestock and came on a wagon train going across the southern part of the community. And these people were lost. They were headed to Zuni, Pueblo. And so they asked him to guide them there. And then they had this agreement with him that on their way back, they would drop him back off at Laguna on the way back to Texas. And so he did that. He jumped on the train. He took him to Zuni. On the way back, they took a different route, southern route, and they took him back to Texas with him. And so my great-grandfather was raised in Texas. I don't know what part of Texas he was raised in, but he was raised in Texas. And so as a young man, he returned to the Pueblo. He came in as a Indian cowboy, 10-gallon hat, 6-shooter, riding a horse, the whole bit. And he came back with the name Smith. So the family name, so we kept the family name, Smith. So that was the family that, I guess, hijacked him, kidnapped him, or however you want to put it. But they raised him in Texas. So when he came back to Laguna, so when my dad tells the story, he has a spin to it. So he says, he always tells people, because he was one of the lifetime Dallas Cowboy fans. So he always tells people that he has relatives still in Texas. And one of his most famous relatives is a gentleman by the name of Emmett Smith. So, so he would get a laugh out of that. But anyway, I grew up in Laguna, New Mexico. I consider myself a res kid. I grew up on tribal lands. I was born in Winslow, Arizona. My mother is from the Hopi Reservation in northern Arizona, and my father is from Laguna. And there was an economic reason as to why Winslow became important in our lives, in the fact that in the early of last century, when they were building the railroad through tribal lands, the tribal leadership negotiated with the railroad company for that right of way, and the tribe was never compensated monetarily, but the railroad company offered jobs to our tribal members. And so many of our tribal members took that opportunity and relocated to various stops on the Santa Fe line. So the famous, and we actually established little colonies of lagunas in these locations. And the famous ones that they don't exist today, but they were part of what we recognize as satellite communities. We're in Barstow, California, in Winslow, Arizona, in Gallup, and in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so my grandfather was relocated to Gallup and worked for the railroad. And that's where my dad grew up, in Winslow, Arizona. So that's about 75 miles south of the Hopi reservation. So that's where him and my mom met and got together and started their family. And so I have 4 brothers. One of them is deceased, and 2 sisters that were came from that family situation. But again, we moved back to Laguna as I was about 4 years old. And so I spent most of my childhood in Laguna. Finished high school at the local high school there. And then I came on down here to New Mexico State and attended New Mexico State in the 70s, 72 through 77, and got my degree in the business school and majored in business management. So that's a little bit about me and where I come from. So enough about me, and I know you want to hear more about tribes. In New Mexico, there are 3 main tribal groups, tribal ancestry groups. The first one is referred to as Pueblo, the Pueblo group, and there are 19 of those Pueblo groups. They're also subdivided in language, dialect. So they're referred to, the 19 are referred to in 5 dialect groups: the Tewa, the Towa, the Tiwa, the Keres, and the Zuni. So so that's kind of how we're split amongst the 19 pueblos. But there's 19 pueblos in New Mexico, and they all pretty much are aligned in the Rio Grande Valley, in the Rio Jemez Valley, as well as the Rio San Jose Valley watersheds. The other main group is the Navajo Nation, and that's probably the most well-known group. They're the biggest, largest tribe in the United States. They have over close to 500,000 people. They have a huge land base that covers 4 states, in New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Colorado. And then the third group, there's 3 Apache groups: Northern Apache, the Hickory Apache; in southern New Mexico, the Mescalero Apache; and more recently, another group moved in between Las Cruces and Demon, and they're part of the Chiricahua group at the Aquila Flats location. They have a small area of land there that they have designated for themselves. And I think there's a small bingo operation there. But those are the 3 Apache groups. So when you go back to the history of these groups, I'll start off with the Pueblos. We always believed, as the Pueblo group, that our origin from the beginning of time was in these land areas. I know there's scientific studies done on migration patterns of different tribes, and there are some migration literature out there about our Pueblo group migrating to this area. But in terms of our own internal historic information, we are always taught that we originated someplace that is a place called Shipap. The word Sipapu in Colorado is an off branch of that word, Shipap, and that's really where the people basically entered, the world here in this world, coming from a previous world. And so then they begin their migrations. One of the patterns of migration, one of the famous stops is a place called Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, Bandelier. Those are the locations of Pueblo migration. So then, and as I said, present day tribal locations are down the Rio Grande Valley, down the Rio Jemez Valley, the Rio San Jose Valley. The only other one that is kind of located outside those three valleys is Zuni Pueblo, and that's south of Gallup. There's another Pueblo group that's in Arizona that we recognize as a sister Pueblo, and that's the Hopi Tribe. So, and the main characteristics of the Pueblo people, although we all started out as hunter-gatherers, but we basically established ourselves in communities, and you see community lifestyles. You know, you don't see major migration, so they built a significant housing complex like you see in Chaco Canyon, Bandelier, you know, but they basically resided as communities, and for many years after that, they became, you know, farmers and traders, intense traders. The Apache people came later, as our history tells us, and basically they are actually relatives of the Navajo people, and they're also relatives of the Athabascan people up in Alaska, northern Canada. And so they were very nomadic people, and so they spent a lot of time wandering, you know, as they migrated down this area. So you don't really see any historical major landmarks of their settlements, because they spent most of their time moving, you know, from place to place based on their needs. So it's benefited, especially the Navajo people, in that they've been able to acquire huge amounts of land, because, you know, they've been able to document, you know, the places that they migrated through. Historically, the Pueblo people and the Navajo and Apache people were not necessarily, because they had two different lifestyles, nomadic lifestyle versus communal lifestyle. They weren't always friendly to one another. You know, in fact, historically, before the Spanish and Europeans showed up, we were basically enemies of one another. And so they would come and raid our communities, just like, you know, you read in how they raided, you know, a lot of the settlers and so forth. So that was their lifestyle, and they were very nomadic in their ways. The Apache people, basically, as I mentioned, are from the Athabascan groups, and their main areas of residency today are for the Jicarilla is near Dulce, New Mexico, and then the Mescalero group is near Rio Doso, in that area. And I said the last group, the Chiricahua Apache, they basically were moved to Oklahoma, a place called Fort Seals, Oklahoma, and then more recently they were able to establish ties to New Mexico, because this area, Las Cruces area, is where their most famous ancestor, you know, hung out, and that was Geronimo. Geronimo was a Chiricahua Apache, and so he spent most of his life, you know, in this Las Cruces, northern Mexico area, and so because of that, they were able to show tie to this area and were able to establish themselves in New Mexico. There are two ways in which, and then the Navajo group, as I mentioned, are nomadic, and they just basically migrated in bands across the Southwest. So you have a main body of land for the Navajo people, and their capital is in Window Rock, Arizona. But they have satellite communities in New Mexico. One is called To'Hajiilee, that's west of Albuquerque, probably about 15 miles west. And you might be reading about this group that's having trouble with water, and the city of Albuquerque is trying to negotiate right away to get them, you know, potable water. So that's if you read in the journal, Albuquerque Journal, in the paper, you'll see stories about, you know, what they're trying to do there. The other group is a group that's just south of Zuni, called the Rama Navajo group. And then there's a third group that's near Magdalena, New Mexico, and they're the Alamo Band of Navajos. So you have the main band of Navajos that's housed in Window Rock, and then you have 3 satellite Navajo communities in New Mexico. Characteristics of the tribes and just the general characteristics of these tribes, each of these tribes are actually separate, distinct sovereigns. They are one of the 3 sovereign nations in this country. You have the United States as a sovereign, then you have states as sovereigns, and then tribal entities as sovereigns. Now, in order to get the status as a sovereign, you have to be designated as they call a federally recognized tribe. So so you get recognition federally through 2 basic processes. One is through the Department of Interior, and you've got to go through a pretty lengthy process of justifying and showing your ancestry to tie you to an established tribe. And then the Department of Interior then evaluates and makes a determination that you qualify to be a federally recognized tribe. The benefit of being a federally recognized tribe is then you're eligible for a lot of federal programs in the federal system. And then the other way you get recognized is through legislation. So you can get your congressman, senator to basically put through legislation that gets you recognized through Congress itself without having to go through the agencies. And so you have a lot of tribes, especially when gaming popped up as an economic activity, they used the legislative channel to get recognized. They didn't have to go prove ancestry. So tribes, especially on the East Coast, like the Pequots, the big property up in northern, in the northeastern part of the country, they were able to get recognized through a legislative process. So those are the 2 basic common way of getting recognized as a federally recognized tribe. Each tribe has a distinct language. So, my mother, who's from the Hopi Reservation, and my father, who's from the Laguna Reservation, they speak a different language altogether. So there are a few words that you find in common in a lot of language, but a lot of those words have a Spanish origin. So, there were things that happened as life evolved in the Southwest, where things were brought in, like, for example, horses, sheep, and there was no word for those animals. So they would take the Spanish word and they would just, basically modify it a little bit with a accent or whatever, to make it sound like an Indian word, So in our language, we call a horse caballo, which is Spanish. We didn't have apples, but we in our language we refer to the apple as manzana, which is the Spanish word for apple. So there's a lot of words that we use in our language that have a Spanish origin. And then as the Western civilization, when the United States controlled this area, then other things popped up. For example, a mug, a cup, we just refer to as mucka, which is mug, So there are little things, little stories like that in terms of how we created words that you would think is a native word, but it really has either Spanish or an English origin. But many of those languages are distinct. Each tribe has their own system of determining tribal membership. It's really something that's really interesting when you talk about, being a member of a tribe. The federal government recognizes you have to recognize you as a tribe. Then how do you determine that you're a member of the tribe? So some tribes use ancestry. If you can show that your great grandmother was and you hear this a lot in Indian country, a Cherokee princess, then you can be eligible to be a member of the Cherokee tribe. One of the main ways that a lot of tribes use to recognize, and that my tribe is one of them, is really blood. As part of the 1940 census, it didn't really matter, what tribe you came from. If you were living in the Laguna proper area, you were given 4/4, you were full blood. Like it's a glass of water, you had a full glass of water. And then as the next generation came about, then they started dividing it half, quarter if you marry within the tribal group. So so now we've gotten really sophisticated. We go down to 1/64th in recognizing tribes. So it's becoming a nightmare for many tribes. But that blood quantum system was really a federal process. It was a federal process that says that you have to prove that you're an Indian, and the way you do it is by blood. So many tribes adopted the federal standard for being recognized as a member of a tribe. There are tribes that rejected it, where basically they recognize it, and most tribes, especially Pueblo tribes, you basically have what's called a clan system, where the tribe has different clans, and your responsibility in the tribal society is based on what clan you are. So each clan has a specific function and responsibility for the society, and then it's matrilineal in my tribe. So you get your responsibility as a tribal member from your mother, and you get your clan from your mother. So my mother is from the Hopi reservation, and she is from the Fire Clan. So I get her responsibility as a Fire Clan member. My father is an Antelope clan from Laguna, so that becomes a minor clan. But your main clan is your mother's clan. And there are some traditions that go heavily along with that. For example, in marriage, in Western culture, if a male wants to marry a young female, then normally the process is that you go ask the woman's fathers for permission to marry her. In our culture, it's the reverse. The woman has to come after the man. And the woman does not get permission to do that from her parents. She has to go to her paternal uncles, to get permission to marry. So those clan systems, a tribal member who is really deep in tradition, there's a lot of sub rules that you have to go through in terms of these societies and the ways. But you find that, you see that a lot in when I visit different tribes. I'm able to kind of understand how they do different things based on some of that stuff that we share in common. What I tried to do in terms of just trying to give you oversight of what's going on today in tribal environments is try to break it down into three main institutions and societies. One is basically culture, and then the second institution is governance, and the third institution is economics. And so when I began to take a look at in general in terms of what we're dealing with tribal wise and common across the state, is that most tribes have adopted basically following, and a lot of us basically gain our culture from religious groups, And so as we were created, we have our own tribal religion, and we have our own legends like the Bible. You cannot study them because they're not written, they're oral traditions. So you have to be taught these legends, stories from someone, your grandparents, your parents, and it kind of drives, then social order, behavior. So from our traditions, basically, we consider ourselves, as one of our origins stories tell us that at the beginning of time, there was always a male and female presence. And Christianity tells us there's a male presence, God, at the beginning of time. But our oral traditions tell us that there was always a male and female at the beginning of time. And so Christianity is the basis for the male or the father's religion. And we're told our religion is based on our mother's beliefs. So we believe that we are the product of our mother's teachings. And so that's why you see in a lot of our activities, the females have a lot of authority and power in governing or basically running, the households and running the daily lives of our tribal membership. The women have a lot to say, and so forth. Again, these clan societies are example of that. Before I can do anything traditionally within our culture, I have to get, if I'm married, I have to get my wife's permission to do that. If I'm not married, I have to get my mother's permission. If I don't have a wife or my mother's gone, then I have to get my sister's permission to participate in those things. And a lot of it is basically a control of behavior, because then they're objective, especially in a marriage situation. Sometimes parents are too involved in what's going on. So they move it to a second level of people that can be more objective about evaluating whether that's a good thing to do or not. So that those processes, semblances of them still exist. We've been influenced a lot by outside cultures, and more so as the generations go forward, a lot of these traditions are becoming less and less as it relates to making those kind of decisions in our lives. But we do have our basic traditional beliefs. And one example that I'm sure you see a lot of is in Hopi, the Kachinas. I don't know if you ever seen those, but
Yeah.
that's a representation of those deities that are in our spiritual culture beliefs. We also have been very influenced by the Spanish and Christianity and Catholicism. When the Spanish came through here, basically they brought their Catholic missionaries, and most of the tribe were introduced to Catholicism. And most of the tribes, basically were following. They did convert a lot of our folks to Catholicism. And so in most of the Pueblos today, you see a lot of Catholic presence. You see most of our Pueblo communities, the primary center is a Catholic church. That happens in the Pueblo countries. Now in the Apache and Navajo countries, a lot of they have their traditional beliefs as well, but they're influenced by U.S. policy, where missionaries petitioned at that time the Department of War, because as tribes would move on reservations, they were the responsibility of the Department of War, because we're basically prisoners of war. And so the Department of War then gave permission for different Christian missions to go out and missionize, different tribal groups. So it depended on who got permission to Christianize the Apaches, or who got permission to So in the Hopi reservation, where my mother comes from, the Mormon religion is very strong. You go to Navajo country, you see a lot of the Baptist Christian communities. In my community at Laguna, again, because we're Pueblo, we have a strong Catholic presence. But when the U.S. military came in, they used Laguna as a military post. And they also brought in Protestant missionaries. And Laguna has Protestant and then later Presbyterian churches in our community. So, that's the second part of culture and things that affect, decision making as it relates to morals, values, ethics, those kind of things. So today, when you look at what we do, you'll see that you'll see a lot of mixture between our tribal traditions, and you'll see a lot of semblance of Christian traditions. Every Pueblo tribe has a patron saint in of their tribe. My tribe at Laguna, their patron saint is Saint Joseph. Okay, and so they have feast days that they celebrate the feast day of Saint Joseph. And so what they'll do is they'll start it off with a Catholic mass, and then they'll move to the plaza and they'll do traditional dances all day until evening, and then they'll take the saint back to the church, and they rest the saint, and so then the community members get to go home to their families. But for most folks, those activities are open to the public. So if you want to witness one of those feast days, I will tell you to go to the All Indian Pueblo Council website, All Indian Pueblo Council website, and they'll have a listing of all the feast days, and you can go in and witness. It's a fun activity. They have arts and crafts, they have dances, and so forth. So if you're interested in participating or seeing those, you'll see them. The Feast of St. Joseph is March 19th in my Pueblo. And so if you're up in that area, then you'll do that. The community members in those feast days to honor that saint, they basically prepare a meal for the whole community and all visitors to the Pueblo. So they open up their houses to any visitor to the Pueblo and they feed them. It's just mind-boggling in terms of what they do in terms of those fiestas. Now, from a government standpoint, most of us started out as governance. We were governed by theological structures because of our legends. But as we got introduced to the Spanish, we began to adopt the Spanish monarchy system. That's why in my Pueblo, we don't refer to the head of our Pueblo as a chairman or a president. We refer to them as a governor because it came from influence from the Spanish monarchy. Okay, we have officers called mayordomos, which is the Spanish word for the ditch or the water system managers. So a lot of our governance systems was an adaptation from the Spanish monarchy system. Then as the US government came in and took over jurisdiction of these areas, then in some areas, we've adopted our governance on democracy. So we have tribal councils now. And in my tribe, we actually, are going through elections this year and voting our leadership. Okay. Now, normally in Pueblo country, you have what is called traditional governments and you have non-traditional governments. My tribe is considered a non-traditional governments because we elect our leaders. In those traditional governments, the people have no say as to who their leader is. The religious leaders, the people that head up of these religious societies in our culture, they appoint the leadership. And basically that leader is empowered by those traditional leaders. So it's like in Las Cruces, the priest of the local mission appoints who the mayor of the city of Las Cruces is. And the people don't get to vote as to who their mayor is. And so those still exist today in Pueblo country. In Apache and Navajo country, they elect their leaders. And most of us have a constitutional form of government that have election processes. Those that are traditional, they don't follow a constitutional form of government. So you can't go to a source constitution to understand how they govern. So from a governance standpoint, that's kind of a broad brush flavor of what you'll see in Indian country. The third part is economics. Now, one of the things that needs to, basically, as we began to move on our migrations in this area, we were basically hunter-gatherers. And then as we established our community, we began to move towards trade and we moved towards agriculture societies. And so as Pueblos, the nomadic people basically, they didn't stop any place at one time. So basically what they did is they raided to get their livelihood. They hunted gathered, but they also raided. So you found in my community, we would have defenses against the Navajo or the Apaches because they would come in and raid our farms and, livestock and so forth. But those were part of the economic cycles that occurred back in those days. Now, when the U.S. government came in, and after in the late 1800s, after the Indian Wars, and you hear about the long walk of the Navajos and the Oklahoma Indians, they basically put us on reservations in designated areas. So basically, that is designated land areas for us. And so those reservations basically became, I term it as kind of concentration camps. And we were restricted totally from interacting with mainstream society. And people who had to join us had to go through federal permissions to engage us or participate with us. As I was going through school and studying government, I came on this Indian law called the Indian Intercourse Act. And stupid as I was, I thought it had to do something with sexuality. But it was actually, if you wanted to engage doing trade or anything with Indians, you have this intercourse with Indians, you had to follow these rules of law to be able to do business in Indian country. So there's plenty of bureaucracy imposed by the feds on how tribes function. Some of it is statutory through law. Most of it is through contract and grants. So a lot of tribes, as it relates to getting resources, back then it was blankets, food, shelter. They would sign agreements that basically forfeited their land, a lot of things that that the Western, folks wanted, government folks wanted. In New Mexico, most of the oppression that Pueblo people experienced was not from the British or the French. It was basically from the Spanish. And so, as Pueblo people sit here today, we still are experiencing having to work through the oppressors. As you look at state government, it's basically controlled mostly by the Hispanic folks. And so we have that long history of having to deal with that culture and trying to preserve, our way of life and things that we're dealing with. Because that happens, a lot of the things that really control economics in the Pueblo, and this is more relevant in the 60s, is that tribes who were economically successful were successful based on natural resources or agriculture, through agriculture and forests. A lot of them had minerals on their lands, oil, gas. So as you look at economic prosperity differentiation between the tribes, you see a lot has to do with the fact that minerals resources were located on those tribal lands. Okay. And so at that time, those tribes that had gas reserves, that had minerals, on my reservation, we had the world's largest open pit uranium mine. So, our tribal coffers were pretty flush, considering what other tribes were experiencing during that period of time, because we got royalty income off those leases on the mining of that uranium. But that basically, and we tease each other because at that time, my fellow brothers from other tribes, we get on the airplane, we'd sit in first class and they'd have to sit in coach, Unfortunately with gaming, because gaming is market-based, population-based, now it's become some of those tribes are a lot more prosperous than us. So my brothers from Sandia Pueblo sit in first class and I sit in coach now. So, those economic things really have a lot to do with, location, goes back to 201 marketing, location. And so if you're fortunate to be located on natural resources, then you did a better, you had a better economic situation. Then the federal government came in the 60s and started giving tribes a lot of programs, health programs, housing programs. It was good that happened because it helped build communities, strengthen communities and housing and so forth. But unfortunately, what it's created for us as tribal people is it's created a situation where there is heavy dependency on those programs. One of the factors that we have to deal with is that as tribes, you're going to hear as you research this thing called trust responsibility. In tribal lands, reservations are in trust for these tribes. So technically, land on my reservation is actually owned by the US government, held in trust for me as a tribal member. Okay. From a safety standpoint, it sounds great that the US government is standing behind protecting my lands and making sure that it's there forever. From an economic standpoint, it's a disaster because I cannot use my land to leverage private lending, where in most communities in the country, your home, the land holdings, your asset base, you can leverage to start up a small business or something like that. In our situation, it's very difficult to do that because it's basically it's not a capitalistic based society. It's government economics. Government owns everything. The federal government owns everything. The tribal government owns everything. So you see very little personal wealth in those communities, and there's a heavy dependency on federal programs, and it almost works to the opposite, because if you want to see something positive in your life, like a new home, you have to prove that you're poor under these federal programs. And so it just doesn't necessarily work in our community. You know, I understand the intention of these programs to help in poverty. So as you saw my resume, I was the president and CEO of one of the largest privately owned corporations, governmentally owned corporations in the state of New Mexico. I built it from a $1 million investment to a $250 million enterprise. But I was subject to government leaders controlling what I did, you know, and it was very difficult, because, you know, government economics is different than private sector economics, and so it became more a constant struggle to begin to fight the political factors in the tribe, because there are political groups that, you know, always are trying to get influence and power over a society. Most of that came through political channels. So, you know, the thing that really, for me personally, you know, moved me towards retiring last year was the fact that I just, you know, had enough of not being evaluated on the bottom line in terms of my profitability and what I built this corporation, but, you know, political factors in the tribal community. So what you see is a huge out-migration of a lot of the best and brightest. So most of our best and brightest that have gone on to college and have degrees, and they're living in urban environments now, because they don't want to have that much, they don't want to have government controlling that much of their lives. And so it makes it, you know, on one end, it provides security. On the other end, you know, it's pretty hard to create personal wealth in those communities. In economic terms, again, gaming is the big boy right now, you know. But we all know, as business, you know, I learned that in my 201 business class, is businesses have a birth, they live, and they die, right? And so they have their cycles. So if you're totally dependent on one industry, then you're going to see prosperity and demise based on what happens within that industry. We learned that from the uranium industry. Now we're going to be seeing that from the gaming industry, because at some point, you know, there's huge profits. It's mind-boggling what you have, because tribes are non-taxable entities. Can you imagine that? Tribes do not pay federal income tax. So I was able to run a business that has 70% margins in gaming with no tax liability. So it was a significant benefit to tribes that the federal government allowed tribes to enter into the gaming industry. But at some point, we're spoiled. You know, we expect every business to turn 70% margins. And, you know, and so if they're not producing those kind of margins, then something's wrong. You know, I started my first business in the retail business as a small C-store. When you're lucky that you have 5% at the bottom line, you did a great job if you have 5% at the bottom line. Those kind of businesses aren't really open for government management. So, you know, those are good mom and pop operations. They're entrepreneurial type operations. But when you have government controlling everything, the small C-store at Laguna is owned by the government and run by the government. So those kind of things are things that tribes are experiencing right now. And fortunately, unfortunately, gaming gives us the ability to behave that way. At some point, we're going to lose this golden goose, and hopefully, I'm not going to be around when that happens. But the reality of it is that's going in there. In closing, I know I took a little more time than I wanted to, but, you know, again, I talked about trust responsibility. I talked about business and economic wealth. I talked about our culture, you know, and the basis for our culture as it relates to, you know, religious principles. And then I talked about our governance situation. So that being said, hopefully, Paul, I did what you asked me to do.
Oh, you did a fabulous job. Anybody want to have some questions and comments? Turn off your clicker there so you can ask questions. Lisa, you go ahead. Elena, rather.
I thank you so much. That was a really interesting talk. But I spent 15 years in central Arizona being surrounded by different tribes, you know, Yavapai, Apache, Hopi, Navajo, a lot of different tribes. And my question to you is with, like you were saying, they're making a lot of money with these gaming enterprises. Are they diversifying that money? Are they actually investing that money in anything that you know of?
I would say the outside of the federal government, because you know the tribal government, excuse me, the tribal government coffers in those tribes, especially based on the size of their gaming operation, the government wealth has increased significantly in those tribes. The challenge that these tribes have is moving that wealth into the community.
Okay.
And invest in housing, in things that can build capacity, economic capacity within the community. So where these leaders get trained is in the federal government. And where does the federal government get its money? They get it from Congress, right? And where does Congress get its money? It gets its money from taxation, right? So with no taxation in that community, most of the money sits in tribal coffers. Okay, and then they use those monies for governmental programs. Okay, now the other two groups that make a lot of money in Indian country are lawyers and financial advisors. I don't know of a financial advisor that got paid based on performance. They get paid based on the size of the portfolio they manage. And so it's their interest to have the tribe keep their money in investment portfolios so that they can then manage that money for them, and they get huge fees. So that the lawyers and the financial advisors that work for my tribe, they're rich people. Where community members are still struggling. And you see that.
Yeah.
You see that common amongst reservations. You go down to the Pima Salt River community, and in the middle of Phoenix and Scottsdale.
Yep.
And you can just see the line between Scottsdale and their community. And that's one of the, probably when you look at it, it's one of the richest tribes in the country. The challenge is they've been trained in federal bureaucracy that doesn't necessarily invest strategically into the community. Now, there's one tribe that's done it really well, and that's the Pueblo of San Felipe. San Felipe, Pueblo, they're a small tribe in north of Albuquerque. What they've done is they've taken a piece of their gaming revenue and they basically have invested into housing construction on their tribal lands. And one of the criteria for you to, basically as a general contract to build those homes, okay, you have to hire tribal members who are the tradespeople, the plumbers, the so forth. So they've had to go through a whole program of teaching these tribal members, first of all, their trade to get them certified and licensed. And then secondly, they taught them the business acumen and how to manage a business. So they've done a tremendous job in growing their capacity by the tribe basically buying, they just showed on, I was looking at the Albuquerque Journal the other day, they have a contract out for the renovation of like 30 homes in that community. And again, it's designated, and so they built their capacity inside the tribe. So there's good models out there. My tribe hasn't learned those things yet. So
any other comments or questions? Yes, go ahead, David.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. A very, very interesting presentation. So tell us about the status of youth in the various tribal groups and education. Are these groups investing in the education of their youth?
The two things that I refer to is public education and private education. I guess the positive, one of the major positives of missionary influence into our community are the missionary schools. For example, I went to Catholic school my elementary years, and I spent a lot of time having to take care of basic stuff, you know. So I got a very good Catholic education, a private Catholic education, as I grew up. Now, but when you go to public education, they're not performing very well. Your public education systems perform, I think, better in urban areas than they do in rural areas. And so the quality of education was not very, very good. My you know, one of the reasons I'm down here in Las Cruces is because I relocated my family down here about 6 years ago because of education, their education. And so I have a younger son who has an education. I forgot what you call it, an issue that he had to take care of. So
A learning disability.
Disability. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, when he was going to the school there, he was a DNF student. Okay, and he got passed through the system. Okay. We moved him down here, and he went to Centennial High School his freshman year here, and he went from a DNF student in our local school there in our community to graduating as a National Honor Society student.
Wow.
And this semester he is finishing his undergraduate program, and he's actually going to finish in 3.5 years. He beat all of us, you know.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the quality of education, you know, really, I was told many years ago, you know, if you want to get your kids into a quality, give them a quality education, send them to where the rich people sent their kids.
Yeah.
And usually I found that those programs are much better, you know, stronger. Now we sacrifice the cultural aspects of it, but I can teach culture because I'm actually a traditional leader, a cultural leader in my Pueblo. So I can teach them the culture. I don't need the schools to teach them the culture. I need the schools to teach them reading, writing, arithmetic, you know. And so once we got that strained out, we moved along pretty well. So you're going to see that a lot of these kids that are coming through the reservation schools, you know, probably the success rate right now of a student going through those systems and actually getting a college degree is probably 0.5%.
Oh.
But do you think that's a result of being in that system itself, or is it the teachers? Because we talked about this at one of our meetings, we were discussing this and what actually causes that.
When I recruited business leaders, you know, I would put an ad out for business leaders. One of my first questions is, if you're any good, why are you applying for this job? Why aren't you working for IBM? Why aren't you working for, you know, Amazon? Why, you know? And really what basically I find out through that whole process is a lot of rationalization of lack of competency. So we don't always get the best and brightest. So what you have to do is you have to build that from within, your own society, your own groups. And so that's, to me, is the missing element, is the fact that we do not have the internal training programs of evolving our own people into these positions of that are vested in the community. It's a struggle because the standards that they, you know, and we have tribal schools, but they're more looking at and the reason I say this, I actually sat a term on the Grant-Cebolla County School Board, and I dove into this. And what I found was when it came to resources, when it came to attention, we're an afterthought. And I think that's just not reservation communities, it's rural communities. Your urban communities get tremendous resources. They get tremendous capacity. And so there is that issue. I think it's just basically closer to market.
Is there any
capacity.
technical training on the Pueblo or reservations? Any
Not-
technical, like vocational training?
I think a lot of that had to do with, people from my generation, and I had this discussion with my kids the other night. I had choices when I came out of high school. Okay. One is that your vocational programs, I mean, first of all, in high school, you had trades being taught,
Yeah. Yeah, well, I did too.
I learned accounting because in high school, when I went to school, there were certain classes that were patterned for the girls and certain courses patterned for the males. So you had shop and you had
Right.
auto mechanics and you had those for the males. And then you had typing and you had bookkeeping for the females. Because I wanted to hang with the females, I took typing and I took bookkeeping. I was one of the few males in a 30 people class, all females. So then when I got to college, accounting 201 was just a repeat of 2 years of bookkeeping in high school. Yeah. So you had choices, and those things were available to you to basically, fill you out in terms of what your interests were. Okay. Then when you left high school, you had choices to go to vocational schools.
Yeah.
Right. You had choices to go on to college, and then you had choices to go to the military. The other one is that the unions were pretty heavy in their training programs. You could go through a union training program as a plumber, as an entry laborer, and work your way up in the union programs to become a master electrician or plumber or so forth. When you look at the choices today, those things don't exist anymore. It's all go to college.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the major issues that we're confronted with in this country, in this state, and in my community, is everybody is being prepared to go to college.
Right.
Not everybody is college prepared.
Right. We got about 4 minutes left. Any other questions or comments?
Go ahead, Vijay.
Paul, I have a question. I have worked with both Potawatomi Indians and Hickoryas.
Okay.
Potawatomi is during the Wounded Knee time, but with Hickoryas for 4 or 5 summers. And one of the problems, of course, we came in late. I'm sorry, we were late in coming in. You may have covered it. One of the major problems, I was doing a lot of work related to nutrition with the elderly, with the women of the Hickoryas, and had a fabulous time for 4 or 5 summers. Really, really doing well. Made a lot of relationships and all.
Sure.
But one of the major problems I saw when I would go to my motel to stay overnight were the young children, teenagers out there at the bar place and drinking alcohol. So alcoholism starting very young. I'm talking about Hickoryas now, and also diabetes prevalent quite a bit. And they complained a lot about Indian Health Service and getting services and all. I'm not putting IHS down, but I'm just saying that was one of the major problems. And we see that happening at a lot of reservations, and major problem is the diabetes.
Well, probably in Indian country, the major killers today is not alcoholism, it's diabetes and hypertension.
Okay.
What you have is issues with diet.
Right.
But it goes back to the commodity era.
Right.
Where the federal government was providing food through commodities.
Right.
And those ones always the healthy.
Good old agriculture.
Healthy stuff. Our people grew up as farmers, but we got transitioned out of being farmers into wage earners. Right. So I grew up, I was telling the kids the other day, I said, you'll never think about this, but if you go through the Laguna Valley, everybody used to had orchards. They had melon fields, they had corn fields. And as kids, it wouldn't be naughty, we ran out and stole melons. we went out and grabbed a melon and went up in the hills and ate it, So there was a lot of physical kind of activity going on. I think that one of the things that we have to look at in Indian country is the nutrition. My wife just graduated from New Mexico State. She got her degree in clinical mental health. She got her master's degree. And so she's been doing a lot of research in this area in terms of the impact of diet and so forth on the health and the mental health of our tribal members. And so the unfortunate situation is that Indian Health Service basically is a system that is an adaptation from the main core medical system in our country. And I listened one day to a chiropractor tell me that, or a doctor tell me that our American system no longer teaches you how to be healthy because of the way it's structured right now. The only way doctors get paid is that they give you a drug or they cut you open. So it's not their job, or it's no longer their purpose to keep you healthy and keep you away from drugs or having to cut you open. So I think just not an Indian country, but for society, we no longer have a fundamental understanding of nutrition and health. We, in my opinion, IHS has only become a grandiose pharmacy.
You got that one right. Right.
All you see on television these days are pharmaceutical ads.
Yep.
And some car ads. Anyway, I see Sarah there. I think we need to recognize our speaker and thank him for doing a good job.
I appreciate your time. Thank you.
And we'll
Thank
see
you.
on the
Good job.
golf course, Jared.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Yes, have a
I
good
want to
day.
just announce for next week, we're going to have Elena, you're there someplace.
Ah,
She's going to be talking about what's happening in Cuba. She's been there a lot. She goes back and forth a lot. And she'll be telling us about what's happening in that country. That should be very interesting.
oh, great.
Right.
Okay,
Sounds
thanks,
good.
everybody.
Thank you, everyone.